Involvement with the criminal justice system is life-changing. It matters.
Having a justice system that works is a really important part of a democratic society.
I'm Penelope Gibbs, Director of Transform Justice.
I'm Rob Allen. I've worked in and around criminal justice all my career.
This is the Transform Justice podcast, throwing light on the criminal justice system.
Hearing from people who know.
It's about whether the system's fair
and what can be done to make it better.
Today we're going to talk about one of the collateral consequences of imprisonment, the impact on families. Rob Allen and I will discuss it with two expert guests, Josie Cole and Lorna Brookes. Josie's husband Rob spent 4 years in prison for fraud. On his release 4 years ago, unfortunately, the relationship broke up. Lorna is founder of Time Matters, an organisation which supports children whose parents are in prison. Rob, you do investigations about prisoners who suffer catastrophic injuries, either by trying to take their own lives or being attacked by other prisoners. Do family members sometimes intervene in the run-up to these tragedies?
Well, they try to. I remember one case where the prison didn't actually try to find a prisoner's next of kin, even after he had tried to kill himself. In several others, families have got in touch with the prison to say what needs to be done to keep their loved ones safe. A sister who had looked after this chap for many years told the prison time after time that he needed a particular drug to deal with his mental health issues. And for whatever reason, the medical services simply didn't prescribe it, and he ended up trying to hang himself in his cell. Very distressing case.
What did the prison authorities say about, say, an audit trail where it looks like the sister has been trying to get hold of them?
Well, they would say that they try and make efforts. Some prisons have telephone lines family members can leave messages on, but sometimes they're not even listened to. So it's the implementation, as is so often the case in prisons, that lets things down. Many people who work in prison do try to do the right thing, do try to have a constructive relationship with prisoners' families, but all too often it doesn't happen. Josie, when Rob was imprisoned, how much did you know at that stage about the prison system?
Only what I'd seen on the movies. Because he had been convicted of a non-violent crime, I thought he'd been in open prison. I thought I'd probably be able to bring in food. And when someone goes into prison, I really expected that there would be some kind of process. I thought someone would call me.
An induction process
for families. I thought someone would call and say, are you okay? Do you have somewhere to live? Can you pay the rent? Are the children okay? Do you need some sort of psychiatric support? And there's just nothing.
You didn't get any of that?
Of course, absolutely nothing. And now I know the idea of getting that is kind of laughable.
And you started writing a blog about your experiences, Prison Bag it's called. What prompted you to do that?
I was just so shocked by everything that I was encountering, really. And I knew that everyone I knew didn't know anything about this. And so I just started writing it down. Partly it was therapeutic for me and there wasn't any other way to get that, but it was also almost a way to have something in between the experience and myself. And when really bad things were happening, and they were, it was a way to distance from it and laugh at it and try and find some good things. And also I think there really was this sense that people should know what's happening. And if people knew, would we really do this? And I felt that because it all happened behind closed doors, behind this sort of shroud of secrecy and shame, that it was allowed to be very, very inhumane. I just couldn't believe there was a system that was doing the opposite of what I think everyone would want it to do.
Lorna, you don't have family in prison and you haven't been in prison yourself as a prisoner. How did you get involved in supporting the children of prisoners and why?
Yeah, so I actually wanted to be a child psychologist. And I ended up being in both female and then male estates, doing a research study about resettlement. I interviewed a lot of people in prison, mothers, fathers. But interestingly, the key finding was that they were worried about their children and that they felt that there was no support for their children and families on the outside. And I was thinking, oh, well, there obviously will be. There's thousands of children with a parent in prison. I'll go and find out the information. And then I went looking for the information and the support organisations for the children with parents in prison, and I was shocked. I was like, wow, there literally is pretty much no support. So this was about 16 years ago, and it just motivated me to trial a community-based support group for children with parents in prison. And I've pretty much been doing that ever since. And it's been a joy as well as shocking about the lack of support generally for children and partners.
Josie, your main interface with the actual prisons was through visits. What were they like?
They're traumatic. People are often imprisoned quite far from where you live. It's a huge journey. It's expensive. It's stressful.
And can you just go on a website and book it in really easily?
You can, if all of the right paperwork has been filled out either side, and you can in some prisons and you can't in others. And I think systems are improving on that level. But, I had often had, when he moved prison, sort of difficulty getting access to a visit. And I think that would be extremely hard if, for example, English wasn't your first language or something like that. There's not a lot of help through that process.
And when you get there?
You get checked in and you have to wait in a line. You have to have all the right documents with you and you have to have your papers with you. You queue up for that and then you queue up again outside the prison gates because the visitor centre is just outside the actual sort of imprisonment place, and often it'll be outside in any weather, and you'll be let in when they've got time to let you in often small groups, and then you'll be body searched and your children will be searched in their mouths and,
In their mouths?
you have to open your mouth and move your tongue and they'll touch their hair and, often officers are really nice and try to make that a better experience, but it's not a good experience. And then there'll be sometimes dogs and, it just takes so long to get into the prison. And then you have this tiny window of time and then you're trying to have this intimate experience in this visit hall full of 40 other families. It's a cacophony in there. It's just not fit for maintaining any kind of intimacy. And we got good at it. You get good at doing the processing. You get good at arriving. It becomes like a sort of well-oiled machine. But there isn't a space for genuine connection.
Yeah, I mean, we've had children and families travelling hours and hours, get to a prison visit, wait outside in the rain or the blazing sun even, and then to be told that the visit's cancelled and just be sent home. And that's happens a lot. And this isn't a blame thing, something could have happened inside the establishment, but you can imagine how distressing that is for children and families who've gone to visit their loved one and then they're just sent away. And different establishments have different rules. So we had a girl, she had a particular kind of hoodie on, but she didn't have anything on underneath. And she was said, no, you've got to take that off or you can't go in. Obviously, they didn't want her to go in her underwear, but they were saying, we'll have to give you something else to wear out of a box. But she didn't know that was the rule because it wasn't the rule at the previous establishment. So I think the lack of communication, generally speaking, to children and families about what they can do, what they can't do, causes so much distress.
It's sort of all on you to find that out before you go.
Exactly.
I've looked back afterwards and I've found, oh God, there are all these rules that say I can't wear this and I can't wear that and I can't wear open-toed shoes or whatever ridiculous thing. But you have to look for them at the same time as going through probably one of the most traumatic things that's ever happened to you, which is that your loved one goes to prison. It's sort of the last thing on your mind that maybe you can't wear a hoodie. Because all these rules make sense to a certain extent inside prison, but they don't make sense outside of prison.
I mean, presumably this acts as a sort of disincentive for some people to make visits. Is that your experience, that some children in particular don't want to go? Or
well, we have children who are very neurodiverse, and the stress of the weight, they can't cope with their anxiety, or they might not be able to hold on to a particular comforting toy to take in. And I do understand that they have to be really careful about protecting the people on the inside. And unfortunately, there are people that will use whatever means to get things like drugs into the system. So we do try to explain to the children that we work with that there are mechanisms to help the person that you care about on the inside to keep them safe, but they could be better managed. You know, I have supported quite a lot of families where they just don't visit because it's too stressful, which is really sad.
It's such a blunt instrument. You know, I remember coming once with Rob's mum to visit, who's incredibly frail and needed a cushion to sit on. And I had to smuggle this thing in, and I did actually manage to do it, but it's very difficult. You know, it should be so easy for someone to say, oh, that child really needs that special toy. Just let them take it in. It's all right. And the rules are just so...
like one size fits all.
Yeah.
Josie, I think your older daughter didn't visit Rob for 2 years. Was that because it was just all too traumatic?
She had a couple of really traumatic visits where she was, you know, trying to get Tampax through security and couldn't get out to go to the loo when she needed to go to it. She was in a bad way with her own mental health, and it was actually a family visit, which is kind of the holy grail of all visits. It's a sort of day-long visit and you get to play games, and we'd been waiting for this visit for so long and there was so much pressure on it to go well. And when it came to the day, she actually wasn't well and needed time and attention for herself, but her little sister was there and she just wanted to have a nice time with Dad, and Dad just wanted to have a nice time with us. And it was just really sad, actually, the whole kind of feeling. And then she still visited after that. And eventually she just found that there was me trying to have my connection with my husband and my partner and get whatever I needed. And there was her little sister trying to get what she needed. And she just felt there was no space for her. And she just stopped coming. She felt that it was too much. She felt she was a burden. She felt she was a downer because she was going through really quite intense mental health breakdown, really as a result of her dad going to prison and what happened to the family and the financial insecurity that resulted from that and all the things that result from that. And from being old enough to understand more of what I was going through. And I think sort of watching what was actually family breakdown from a kind of horrified place of not being able to help, but also understanding it.
I really hear what you're saying, Josie, because we have so many teenagers that feel exactly how your daughter felt.
Really?
Oh, loads. Because they feel like they have to be the adults. They have to be the mature one. They have to give space to their younger siblings. They also have to support the parents. And some prisons do have like play areas for little ones, but teenagers absorb so much more. So I just was talking to a family, and it's the older teen of 3 siblings. She says when she goes on visits, and of course she wants to see her dad, but she'll be the person who spends most of the time in the queue for the tea bar, for the chocolate and the drinks, to give her little sister and her younger brother the time and the space that they need. So she goes on these visits, but will spend most of the time in the queue, which can take 20, 30 minutes out of a half an hour visit. So I do think it is really tough for the teens.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that, because I didn't really know that. Because you have very little interface with other families. You have the people that you meet in the queue, but it's a place where even where we're all there visiting people in prison and the shame should be less, it sort of isn't. And people quite often don't speak to each other.
And it's not possibly the easiest time because you're focused on your prison visit and then you've got a long journey home and you're already exhausted by the time you've got there and you're already under pressure for everything to be perfect and for you to look smiley and all of these kind of pressures that you're under, which is probably why I think that when community spaces can happen, that it's away from the prison environment where people can sit down for however long with a cup of tea and have a chat. It's probably a little bit more fruitful, really, in terms of reducing kind of shame and building connection. It's a difficult environment to do that in that queue, in that waiting room, isn't it?
Really is.
Rob, you've seen prisons all over the world. Do any of them do family visits well?
Well, I was remembering as Lorna and Josie were talking, I once visited a prison in Mexico and it was a family visiting day. The prison actually employed 2, they called them animators. So their job was to make these visits go well. They had a stage, They had a band playing, there was entertainers, there was kind of normal stuff that families can do rather than putting all this pressure on, one interaction. So they could spend the whole day, and if they wanted to go and queue for food, that was fine. That wasn't the end of it. And of course, in many countries, there is the opportunity for husbands and wives, partners, to spend some private, intimate time together, so-called conjugal visits.
The couple can actually go off to a private room.
Absolutely, yeah. It's just part of the normality. And in the UK, we don't see that as somehow normal. We would, for whatever reason, see that as being too nice to prisoners to allow that. I don't know. But we certainly need to be thinking about those if we're serious about maintaining relationships while people are in prison, particularly with increasing long terms of imprisonment.
What do you think about these European countries or elsewhere in the world where partners are allowed to have a night on site but privately?
I think that if we'd had that in the UK, then our relationship would have survived. It makes me feel quite tearful to think of that, because it's so hard to be away from someone you love for, in my case, 4.5 years. How do you keep close in that time, particularly when you're going through the most difficult thing that either of you have ever been through? And every interaction you have is watched, every phone call is listened to, every letter is read, every visit hall is patrolled, and that would have made all the difference.
Going back to the children, and you had 2 daughters who visited some or all the time that Rob was in prison. What happened when your younger daughter sat on her father's lap?
This was so awful. It was quite early on in his sentence, and she was so close to her dad, my youngest, Tala, and we were at a visit. She was really tired. She got to the visit and she climbed up on her dad's knee. She would have been 10. And she fell asleep on his lap with her arms around him. And it was such a sweet moment. And her jumper had ridden up, and he was just sort of stroking her back just to sort of soothe her to get her to sleep. And I remember thinking, God, that is so beautiful to see that. I haven't seen that for a long time, and she hasn't had that for a long time. And then this officer just came along and went, "Pull her top up, mate. It's disgusting." And we were just so shocked. We couldn't believe it. And he sort of woke her up, and she went and go and sit on Mum's lap, and she went and sat with me, and he just looked, I've never really seen him look like that. He was so upset and so hurt.
Rob was so upset.
Rob was. And Tyler was just really confused.
Because she thought it was normal to be able to sit
It is
on,
normal to sit on your dad's lap. But what was worse was that a few weeks later, I went to a visit and Rob looked awful. And he said, "I've been put on a watch list for child abuse because a report was made that I was touching my child inappropriately." And he was terrified because he said, if someone sees that, they'll think I'm a paedophile, and then I'll be dead inside prison. I was so angry, and because I had this blog, I began sort of writing about it, and I made a real fuss, and then people wrote to me saying this is terrible, and people wrote to the prison, and in the end, the prison governor wrote to me and said, "Of course, we know that this is not inappropriate behaviour between a father and a daughter, but it's just not appropriate in visits because we have all sorts of people in the visit hall and it just could be dangerous." And that was, in some sense, at least vindicated. But I think it was very unusual that I got a reply, and only really because I was doing this sort of quite public-facing thing. I wrote to prison multiple times, no one replied to me. It was only when someone with a bit of clout wrote in, they sort of had to address it. And I always felt that I'm writing about our family and all these things, I'm kind of whoring out all my personal experiences. But part of it was, I just felt that I had to do it because of things like this. And I hoped it might keep Rob safe as well, because there would be some accountability for him.
Lorna, have you come across similar sort of overreactions by the authorities?
Absolutely, yeah, all the time. A mum was saying the other week that she's got a little girl about 5 or 6 who does gymnastics, and she'd gone in to visit her dad, and she was just trying to show, "Oh, look, I can do the splits now." And the little girl was told off by people who were patrolling the visit, saying, "You need to get her to get off the floor and sit properly." And I think it was just really tough because that little 5-year-old girl felt shamed for showing her dad the splits. And
previously she'd been proud of her gymnastics.
Yeah, she's proud of her achievements. I do understand that, unfortunately, in big visiting hall, you've got to make sure that things aren't being misconstrued. I think it's just being sensitive to the way it's being handled, maybe come over and speaking more softly to the family rather than it being like abruptly told off. And I think as a society, we just forget that the people on the outside haven't done anything wrong, but they're absolutely trying to manage everything, the well-being of the person on the inside as well as their own well-being, their children's well-being. It's huge pressure.
And in amongst this pressure, you've got rules which are set, like no touching your 10-year-old's back, and those are set in the name of safeguarding. Are children of prisoners seen as being at particular risk just because they have a parent in prison, Lorna?
So they'll say, child with a parent in prison, there is a safeguarding concern. Actually, there's a difference between a child being vulnerable and there being a safeguarding risk. So in most cases, the non-offending parent in the community, whether that's mum or a grandparent, are meeting the child's needs enough for there not to be a safeguarding concern, loving them, feeding them, getting them to school. But do they need some extra mental health support? Yes, probably. But they are two entirely different things. Of course, there is a very small percentage of children who've got a parent in prison where the other parent stroke caregiver in the community is also unable to meet their needs. Those children absolutely need to be supported from a statutory point of view by children's services, absolutely. But it just isn't a one-size-fits-all.
What do you advise children and families to tell their friends if they've got a parent or a relative in prison?
Yeah, I think it's personal choice. I think the two key messages is you haven't done anything wrong, you are not alone, and you have nothing to be ashamed of. However, to try to have some sense of choice. If you don't want to say to people where your dad is, let's just use dad as an example, then you can just say, I don't want to talk about it. If you do want to say, actually, my dad's in prison, but that's as much as I'm willing to say on the matter, that's fine too. Obviously, lots of the children and families do go with that white lie and just say, oh, my dad's working away. And I don't think they should be judged for that. We often suggest to parents who tell their children that, their parents are working away, that it might be best for you to tell the child that it is actually a prison in case they find out through other means. It's perhaps better coming from you.
So we're talking about some families you work with where, say, the father is in prison and the mother doesn't actually tell the children that their father's in prison.
Yeah. I think initially it's really common for them to say, your dad's just gone to work away, perhaps when they're trying to get their head around things and they're in that very shock stage. I mean, you go through stages of grief and then in time they think, oh no, I'm ready now to have that conversation and say, it's not actually your dad's work, it's a prison and he made a mistake and this, that and this. You know your child best. And I think, unfortunately, there are some professionals that will say, you need to tell the child, like now. And I don't agree with that at all. I think it's let people have those conversations in their own time and in their own way with support if they want.
No, the thing is that it's a very hard thing for children to understand because children know that prison is a place for bad people. That's what we're taught. That's what prison looks like. That's what the general public think. And a child knows their dad isn't a bad person.
Exactly.
Because the child knows a totality of that person. They don't just know the worst thing that person has ever done in their life that they've been judged on in that moment. And I think that was very hard for especially my youngest to understand the injustice of the system. To know that her dad had so many wonderful things about him and to know that he had been punished in this way and there was nothing that he or she or any of us could do.
Going back to the children then, do some of the children, partly because they can't really understand why their parent is being punished, do they blame themselves, Lorna?
Yeah, they really do. If I had 20 children in a room And I said, do any of you feel like this is your fault? You would be really shocked at the amount of children that would put their hands up and nod. A lot of them are like, well, if I'd have known, I could have persuaded my dad not to do the thing he did, or I could persuaded my mum to have had better friends, or perhaps if I was at home more and, for the older children, I could have supported my parent more. I mean, we had one story where the dad unfortunately had a lot of addiction problems and he was on the run, and the children were both in primary school, and he'd come back to the house and was hiding in the house. And then when the police knocked on the door looking for him, I think one of the little boys went, he's just gone and jumped out that window. And obviously they chased him and he arrested him. And then that poor little boy was so like, my dad wouldn't be in prison if it wasn't for me. So helping them to understand that adults' choices and actions are not your responsibility does take effort. It does take time. Children absolutely do blame themselves.
Josie, does that resonate with your experience at all?
Well, it resonates with a different part of my experience, and I think both of my children blame themselves for our family breakdown during prison. And they felt, I think, that if they had been better or noticed more what was happening with me, that they could have stopped our relationship from breaking down. And after Rob came out of prison and our relationship did break down, our whole family broke apart. My youngest daughter was so upset that she didn't want to see me and didn't see me for over 2 years. And my eldest daughter relationship completely broke down with her dad as well. And it utterly fragmented our family. I think mostly because we loved each other so much and the breakdown was so traumatic and no one could cope with it.
And they blame themselves.
I blame myself. They blame themselves. Rob blames himself. We all blame ourselves for what happened. But ultimately, the system is supposed to do that. It's part of the punishment. I believe it's actually quite intentional. The punishment should be as big as possible, and that includes all the collateral damage. And if that's not intentional, it's certainly not mitigated in any way, because if it were to be mitigated, there would be all sorts of things that you could do to stop that happening.
I mean, Lorna, sadly, I guess what you've just heard isn't uncommon. Have you seen the strain that prison puts on relationships and consequently relationships coming to an end?
100%. I've had the privilege of supporting so many people when their partners have been away and they've stood by their man, if you like, for years and years and years. And then, unfortunately, when the person's come out of prison, the relationship just hasn't survived. We talk about imprisonment being a hard time, but let me tell you now, post-release for some families is even harder.
Absolutely.
People think release is the end and there's going to be this party and everybody's going to be happy and you're going to pick up where you left off. And unfortunately, post-release is the start of a new sentence for a lot of people. And definitely families need as much help in that post-release stage, whether they choose to stay together or whatever happens as they do when someone's away.
That's right. You just all have changed so much because you've been through this extraordinary experience largely alone. It's like you're a family and you're a certain shape and that gets pulled apart and you all grow in different ways separately, and then you try and put all these pieces which can't possibly fit back together again really quickly. And we've split up really fast, 3 months, and everything had broken apart. When I visited every single week in prison, we spoke 2 or 3 times a day on the phone. We really did try everything we could do.
But talking about that, Josie, you were happily married 10 years ago with 2.4 children, a beautiful house, and unlike many of the families of prisoners, a relatively privileged life. Do you entirely rue the day that life changed?
No, funnily enough, I went past my old house the other day and I thought to myself, do I wish that none of this had ever happened? And I sort of thought, if that was the case, I'd just be some middle-class woman with a really lucky, nice life, and I wouldn't know any of this, and I wouldn't want to unknow. It's like sort of pretending that things aren't happening, sort of la 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 la. But I'm glad not to be ignorant of that thing anymore. And I think when you go through something really difficult, you see yourself, and I don't think I particularly like what I saw in the end, but at least I had a chance to look at it.
All the children that I've known over 10 years, 15 years, and they're in their 20s now, and I met them when they were, say, 5 or 7. If I said to them, do you wish none of this would have happened to you? Of course, they don't wish the trauma that they've been through and all the horrific experiences. But honestly, I think almost all of them would say, I'm actually glad this has happened, because it's taught me so much about society, myself, and the resilience and the life skills that you see in some of the young adults that I know now who are doing brilliantly with their lives would honestly often say, I wouldn't change it.
Well, perhaps that's a heartening note to end on. We do close these episodes by asking each of our guests if they were, say, Prime Minister and had the opportunity to do something to improve, in this case, the support to families of prisoners, what one thing would you do? Josie?
ROTL. It's a release on a temporary licence, and it's happening more and more.
But what is it, Josie?
I'm going to tell you.
Okay.
Penelope, hang on. It's where the prisoner is allowed to come home for a night or a weekend, and they come back to the family house during their sentence. And where someone is safe to do so, that would change everything. Because if he had been allowed to come home, say, once a month for a night, we could have had all the conversations we needed to have. I could have actually said what was going on for me and what I was going through. You know, I know people who go through cancer and don't tell their loved one inside prison because they don't want to worry them. It's that level of holding stuff back from each other, and you'd be able to talk, you'd keep the intimacy together, you could show your dad your splits, your cartwheels. It would change everything.
Okay, so more ROTL, release on temporary licence. Lorna, what would your suggestion be?
Let's stop viewing children with a parent in prison as the world's future offenders. Having a parent in prison is an adverse childhood experience, but it doesn't mean that they're going to go out and become criminals just because their parents done something wrong. Not at all.
Right, very good. Penelope?
I'm going meta and saying let's just imprison fewer people, because if we imprison fewer people, we would have hopefully more resources for the few who perhaps need to be behind bars and their families. Rob, what about you?
Well, I agree with each of those suggestions so far. I mean, I think we need a cultural shift here, don't we? To see prisoners' families, in a sense, as part of the solution, not part of the problem. So much of the system seems geared up, not quite seeing them as the enemy, but certainly making it very, very difficult for people to do what they want to do to keep their loved one out of trouble in the future. That's got to change.
Thanks, Josie, Lorna and Rob. If you'd like to read Josie's blog and to find information about Lorna's work, do go to our programme notes. And keep rating us highly on the apps, that is, if you rate us highly. Till next time, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.